Bringing our panel tonight, Tucker Carlson, host of Fox and Friends Weekend, Kirsten Powers, columnist for the Daily Beast, and Jonah Goldberg, at-large editor of National View Online. Tucker, obviously two different places, two different foreign policy objectives, but two different, very different ways to go about it.
That's right. In the clip you just saw, the president's clearly walking back from his previous threat against Syria, and I have to say, I really say it's good for him. The U.S. doesn't have a pressing national interest in entering into the civil war in Syria to a greater degree than we already are. The president already said in this press conference that we will topple Assad, the Assad government. And he also went on to say, by the way, that the U.S. has, and I'm quoting, a moral obligation to stop the killing in Syria. It would be interesting to have him explain where that moral obligation comes from. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bible. We don't have a moral obligation to stop the bloodshed there any more than we do in Congo. We look at it with regret, but there's no obligation to get more deeply involved in this country, and I have to say, I think his restraint is warranted.
Well, he also said there was a moral obligation to act in Libya before the mass graves were there. The mass graves, obviously, in Syria have topped now 70,000 or more. And he said numerous times over the past 2 years, year and a half, Kirsten, that Assad's days were numbered. They now number 500 plus days.
Well, I think when they're saying, you know, his days were numbered, they were expecting him to fall, and things haven't really necessarily gone the way that they wanted them to. But I would disagree. I think we do have a moral obligation to intervene when we can, and every situation is not the same. Libya and Syria are not the same situations. I'm not even saying, I mean, I didn't actually support the Libya intervention based on the information that we had, but I think that when you have good information and when you can act, you should, if it's minimal loss of life to the United States. And I think what the president's saying is we don't have enough information. That's his position right now, is that he wants to be absolutely sure before we do anything. And I don't think it would necessarily be a humanitarian intervention at this point anyway, since 70,000 people have already died.
Jonah.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree a little bit with Tucker as well. I won't go so far as to say I agree with Kirsten, because, you know, we don't want to mess with the bookies or anything. No, but I think you do what you can where you can to stop things like genocide and mass killing. That doesn't mean you always do it. That doesn't mean there aren't other factors that come into play. But, you know, when President Obama elsewhere in that press conference today, he said, you know, look, people think I'm not going to do anything. As we know from bin Laden, we know from...
Let's play that soundbite right there about credibility.
I would just point out that there have been several instances during the course of my presidency where I said I was going to do something, and it ended up getting done. And there were times when there were folks on the sidelines wondering why hasn't it happened yet, and what's going on, and why didn't it go on tomorrow. But in the end, whether it's bin Laden or Gaddafi, if we say we're taking a position, I would think at this point the international community has a pretty good sense that we typically follow through on our commitments.
Yeah, I think it's pretty outrageous what he just did there. Because basically, first of all, when he says we, he's basically using the royal we and talking about himself. And this is about his credibility, what he has said. He wants to pretend that he's been consistent all along. You know, he's talking about what he said about Syria as if he's talking about finishing a model airplane or something, that it can just sit on your desk and nothing will change until you come back to it. The standard he set up in Libya was that we can't stand by while people are being slaughtered. Red lines, you know, red lines delayed are red lines denied in a certain sense. Just ask the Sudeten Germans. And at the end of the day, the standards that he has set for himself in terms of Libya and all the rest have boiled down to him basically saying, let the slaughter continue. Now, I'm not saying that we should go in now. I actually think that circumstances have changed to a point where Tucker's argument has more weight in that it's less obviously in our interest now than it might have been a year ago when we actually could have had a better impact on all of it.
But what about the credibility argument, Tucker? I mean, what we're talking about here, right. Say the president says one thing, he puts it all on the line, the United States credibility is on the line. That's
a valid point, absolutely. That's a real argument, and I think he has in some way diminished the credibility of the U.S. by not living up to the promise he made. That's absolutely true. Let me just clarify, however, the argument I was making, and it's not that the U.S. shouldn't help other countries or stop genocide. Of course not. We do. We're a decent and rich country, and we have for hundreds of years. The question is whether it's our moral obligation to do so, and that's a very important distinction because from that, policy flows. If we have a moral obligation, you A, have to answer where that obligation comes from, and B, look down the barrel of what that means. That means we have to act. And we don't. We don't, and restraint sometimes is the wiser course. Let me say one more thing. If we topple the Assad government, what comes next? That question is incumbent on anyone who argues on behalf of toppling that government. They don't have an answer. They need one.
Because the available answers now are not as good as they might have been a year ago.
But everything you said is you can have a moral obligation, and everything you just said be completely true. You shouldn't just rush into a country and topple the government. And I actually don't know anybody who's talking about toppling the government.
Obama did today. He promised he would.
I think we're talking more about trying what kind of minimal activity can we do to try to mitigate this situation. I don't think we're talking about necessarily sending ground troops in.
But the biggest question mark is who are the opposition fighters, and what's the composition? There are people that we like, and there are people that we don't know, frankly.
Right, and that's why I was saying that the circumstances now lend themselves more to Tucker's argument, I think, than they might have a year and a half ago. Now, this is basically the Spanish Civil War of the Middle East, where you've got bad guys fighting bad guys, and it's a Sunni-Shia problem. I think there was a time where we could have had a no-fly zone, where we could have encouraged the right rebels, given them a strengthened hand. My understanding from a lot of people is that ship has sailed.
Next up, Barack Obama and big government.